All right, in these last couple of screencasts, we're going to start exploring some of those conflicting schools of thought now that we know about long-run aggregate supply and what that story is all about. I'm going to split this into two parts just to keep it manageable. All right, well, here's the basic dichotomy. We can divide economists essentially into two schools. We can call them the classical school and the Keynesian school. You can think of the classical school as those economists who believe that long-run story. They essentially say that we should leave the free market alone, that it's going to get us back to full employment all by itself, that government is essentially going to mess things up. The other school, we might call the Keynesian school, essentially doesn't believe that full long run story, or at least doesn't believe it's going to be told fast enough to get rid of things like unemployment quickly enough. And as a result of that, we're going to need the government to come in, intervene in the market, and make the economy better. And if you need to attach some faces to these two schools, these might be the faces. We've seen these people before in class. Friedrich von Hayek, who basically represents this free market libertarian view of the economy that we should just kind of leave it alone, and John Keynes, who basically invented macroeconomics and the idea that the government needs to get involved and can actually manage the economy like some sort of complicated machine. Now, the classical school has broken down into a number of differing viewpoints, and we might call these now neoclassical schools, new classical schools, or outgrowths of the original classical model. And there's a few variations of them, and we'll explore each of them in turn. I'm hoping in these couple of screencasts to give you just the basic outline of what these various schools of thought are, and that we can explore them more both online in the various assignments and in class as well. So we're going to divide them into the neoclassical schools and then what we might call the Keynesian, sometimes called the mainstream school. It's called the mainstream school because most economists are some derivation of Keynesian at this point. All right, so going back to classical economists, it really basically started with Adam Smith in 1776, the inventor of the invisible hand, really the inventor of economics. And he was essentially a classicalist. He believed that we should leave the markets alone, that we should undergo a laissez-faire policy, which again essentially means a libertarian free market economy where the government doesn't get involved that much. And the major assumption here is that long-run aggregate supply curve, the fact that it's vertical and the fact that it's at full employment and that we'll be going back to full employment. Now, the Keynesian or the mainstream school is entirely different. It's essentially everything we've learned this semester about the ADAS model, monetary policy, and fiscal policy. All of that stuff was implicitly Keynesian. The basic framework of the Keynesian model is that the economy is going to be where it is based on how much spending is going on in the economy. That GDP is going to be determined by all the spending that everyone does, consumers, businesses, government, net exports. And for the Keynesians, of particular interest was investment, I. They thought that C was relatively stable, G was relatively stable, so were net exports. But they thought that I was very volatile, for reasons I've talked about before. And so that's a major cause of instability in the economy. That might push aggregate demand down below full employment if businesses stop spending money. Another possible cause of instability for the Keynesians is the possibility of AS shocks, bad things happening like hurricanes, wars, disease, things that might move the aggregate supply curve around. They allowed for that possibility, but mostly they focused on aggregate demand and investment in particular as a component of aggregate demand. You'll also remember that it's the Keynesians who thought that aggregate supply has that horizontal segment to it, that part of the aggregate supply curve where prices don't go down anymore. We called them sticky prices before, and we gave a few reasons for that. The first one was efficiency wages, the idea that employers tend to pay their employees above market wages to increase productivity and are reluctant to lower wages even in times of a recession, so wages are kind of sticky. Minimum wage laws and other governmental laws that make wages kind of sticky and hard to adjust over the long term. Insider-outsider relationships, the fact that we're friends with our bosses, we get to know our bosses, and even during a recession when there might be pressure to reduce wages, these people that we become friends with and know are reluctant to reduce the wages of people that they are friends with, that they've been working with for some time. And you'll remember that the entire long run story kind of depended on wages being flexible, that wages would go up or go down depending on whether we were above or below full employment. And if you don't believe that wages are flexible, then that story kind of doesn't make sense, and you might not believe that the economy is going to move us back to full employment. So because aggregate supply has that horizontal segment to it, and since wages and prices might not be flexible, the Keynesians don't believe that long-run story. Or if they do believe the story, they think it's going to take a really long time for that story to play out. Keynes was famous for saying that in the long run, we're all dead. So while the long-run story might bring us back to full employment, if it takes 40 years, it's not really going to help anyone. And that's why the Keynesians see such a need for government intervention. They just think the long-run story won't work or that it'll take too long, and so we're going to need the government to come in and push us back to full employment quicker than the long-run story would get us there. So again, in terms of graphically the way the Keynesians would see things, if we were pushed into a recession, they wouldn't want to wait around for that long-run story. The long-run story, again, would say that in this situation, nominal wages would fall and aggregate supply would shift to the right and get us back to full employment. What the Keynesians think is, nope, we might be stuck at point B pretty much indefinitely until someone does something about it. That long-run story isn't going to happen because wages and prices aren't flexible, or if it is going to happen, it's going to take too long. And so for the Keynesians, they want to see some sort of government intervention to push us back to full employment. Push AD to the right, maybe through fiscal policy, maybe through monetary policy, but do something to get us back to that blue vertical line, that the economy is not going to get us back there all by itself. Again, that's kind of the mainstream view. Most economists are Keynesians, and most economists do see some role for government in getting us back to a good economy. As opposed to the Keynesian view, we could start exploring the neoclassical views, those schools of thought that kind of do believe in the long-run story. And the first one we'll focus on are called the Monetarists. This is a subdivision of the neoclassical schools. These are people that believe the full long-run story, or at least believe that it'll happen eventually. They think it'll be quick enough to get us back to full employment without the government getting involved. Maybe not a day, but in a reasonable amount of time. For the monetarists, the major cause of instability in the economy is government intervention, and specifically bad monetary policy by the Federal Reserve. To understand what they're saying, I have to introduce you to an equation that they rely on called the equation of exchange, which looks like this. MV equals PQ, where M equals the money supply, we've seen that before. V equals velocity, how many times a year a certain dollar is spent. If you've ever been to where'sgeorge.com, you kind of know what I'm talking about here. P in this formula is equal to the price level, measured by some price index, like the consumer price index or the GDP deflator. And Q is real GDP, the amount of stuff produced. And the idea behind the equation of exchange is that the amount of stuff produced, the right-hand side of the equation, is going to be equal to the amount of money that's out there. If there's only $1 worth of purchasing power out there, for example, we're only going to produce $1 worth of stuff, because why produce stuff if nobody's going to buy it? Alright, so to look at this a little bit more holistically, you can look at the left side of the equation as essentially being the purchasing power of money in the economy. M, the amount of dollars out there, times V, the amount of times each year a dollar is spent. You can look at the right side of the equation, P times Q, as being equal to nominal GDP. In nominal terms, the dollar value of goods and services that are produced in the economy. And again, the idea is that the two sides are going to be equal. What the monetarists believe is that velocity V is stable, that it doesn't change that much over time. Now the Keynesians disagree with that. They see velocity as being relatively unstable. So what the monetarists think is that if we're at full employment, Q is basically set as well, right? If we're at full employment, we're stuck at a certain amount of stuff. Q can't really increase either. So they focus on M and P. M is controlled by the Federal Reserve, the money supply. And so if V is kind of constant and Q is kind of constant, you could see by the equation what would happen if we increase the money supply too much. If we increase M, we're not going to get more stuff. For the equation to equal out, something on the right-hand side of the equation is going to have to go up as well, and that's going to be P. In other words, more money is simply going to lead to higher prices. It's not going to lead to more GDP. As a result of that, the monetarists don't want really any fiscal policy, and they don't want the Federal Reserve doing any discretionary monetary policy either. They think that it'll just mess things up. What the monetarists want instead is a rule. They would like some sort of machine that would just spit out more money each year depending on how much more stuff we produce each year. And since historically, real GDP has tended to go up by roughly 3 to 5% each year, they would just like a monetary rule, which would simply spit out 3 to 5% more money each year to buy that additional increase in stuff. In other words, get rid of the Federal Reserve and simply increase the money supply automatically by 3 to 5% a year to account for the fact that GDP goes up by that amount historically over time. All right, finally for the screencast, we're going to look at a second kind of neoclassical school called the rational expectations theorists. These are kind of the hardcore libertarian free marketers in this whole equation. They believe the long-run story, and they believe that it's going to happen very quickly. In summary, what the RET people believe is that businesses, consumers, and workers expect changes in policies or circumstances to have certain effects on the economy, and in pursuing their own self-interest, they're going to take actions to make sure that those changes affect them as little as possible. RET people see the population as being kind of super smart, rational people who know what's going to go on and who make changes and in their lives in order to make themselves as well off as possible. So they see people as being rational, smart, and forward-looking who could see kind of into the future and adjust for what's going to happen. So the RET people believe that wages and prices are very flexible as opposed to the Keynesians. They believe that expectations are forward-looking, and they believe that if adjustment doesn't happen quickly in the economy, it's not the economy's fault, it's probably the government's fault. So to give you a sense of where these schools line up, let me bring you back to the graph and start us off at full employment. Let's say demand pull inflation happens, AD shifts to the right, and we move in the short run to point B. Now the Keynesians think we might be stuck at point B for a really long time because wages and prices aren't flexible. The RET people think that wages and prices are really flexible. That essentially what's going to happen here is that we're going to be above full employment. Businesses and workers are going to recognize that pretty much immediately. Workers are immediately going to start asking for pay increases. Those pay increases are pretty much immediately going to happen. And pretty much immediately, the long-run story will play out by short-run aggregate supply shifting to the left. In other words, the RET people think that we're essentially going to jump from point A to point C very, very quickly, that we're almost always at full employment. And if we're not going to jump from point A to point C very quickly, if we're stuck at B, it's probably as a result of something the government did, some worker production, some friction in the economy that makes this process slow down. The Keynesians think we might be stuck at point B for a really long time. The monetarists probably think that we're at point B because aggregate demand increased because the Fed messed up and created too much money. The monetarists think we're going back to point C, just not as fast as the RET people think we're going to go back there. All right, those are the three major groups, the Keynesians, the monetarists, the RET people. In the next screencast, we'll clean up the other kind of minority views.
That's not fair that I failed the test. You said that I got question 1 wrong.
You did. The Bolshevik Revolution did not result in democracy in Russia.
But a friend told me that D would be the answer.
I am aware that you were trying to cheat. That is why I changed the answers before you took the test.
That's not fair.